Once upon a time in the beautiful village of Kabwe, there was a man named Ken who lived with his family. Everyone in the village admired the family for how successful they were. Ken was married to a woman named Nisa, who gave him a daughter named Julia. But Julia was not his only daughter. Ken also had another daughter named Susan from his first marriage. Ken loved his daughter Julia so much that he gave her everything she asked for, but unfortunately, he had no love for Susan because he believed she was not his biological daughter. In addition, he never loved his first wife because he believed she cheated on him. Ken was doing well in his life and owned one of the largest and most beautiful homes in the town of Kabwe. His daughter Susan was 22 years old while Julia was 19. Susan did practically all the housework, but received little food and sometimes ate nothing all day. Julia, her second daughter, was a naughty girl who liked the party life and went out to have fun every day. One Sunday night, Julia went to an illegal club and the police came to raid, arresting many people, including Julia. When the news reached Ken and his wife, Ken became very concerned and went to see an officer to see if there was any way to free his daughter. He was willing to do anything, but the corrupt officer told him that if he couldn't replace his daughter with someone else, there was no way until they went to trial. Ken quickly agreed to the idea and returned home to take his daughter Susan instead of Julia. Ken promised Susan that when Julia was released from prison, he would treat her well and also send her to college. Susan, who prayed for her father's love day and night, quickly accepted the offer, not knowing that she was about to experience the worst time of her life. After Julia and Susan successfully exchanged places, Susan's stepmother was very happy to be rid of her. In prison, Susan shared a cell with an older woman named Mary, who was very ill and came from a wealthy family. Susan was known for her kind heart, radiant smile, and love for the simple things in life. She truly loved helping people, and because of her nature, she felt very sorry for the sick woman and began to help her. The sick woman always received visits from her son Mike. Mary was in prison because she was framed for the murder of her husband and had been serving time for many years for something she did not do. Mike had sought every means to free his mother, but it was impossible. Susan, on the other hand, had no visitors, no lawyer, and no family. Since Susan arrived in prison, Mary no longer felt lonely. She felt at peace with her because she respected and cared for her so much. Out of curiosity, Mary asked Susan what her crime was, and to her surprise, Susan had committed no crime. Her only crime was seeking the love of her father, sister, and stepmother. Mary promised Susan that when she was released from prison, she would ask her son to help free her as well. Susan's heart filled with gratitude, and she shed tears because she never thought anyone would care about her. Susan was sleeping in her cell when she received an unexpected visitor. It was her father, Ken. Susan, happy to see him, tried to hug him, but he turned her away, saying he smelled too bad. Ken cut to the chase and told her that there was no way she would get out of prison unless she did what he asked. Ken was silent for a moment and remembered what had happened the night before. He remembered that he needed to save his business by signing a deal with the richest man in town, whose identity was secret for security reasons. At the police station, Ken asked Susan to sleep with the man, but Susan refused. After much pressure, Susan gave in to her father's manipulations. That night, a luxurious car picked Susan up and took her to a hotel room where she was to meet the rich man. The room was dark and the man spoke in a different tone so as not to be recognized. He asked Susan to undress, and, although she could not see, she tearfully obeyed. Mike, the man, grabbed her without protection and took her virginity. Neither Mike nor Susan saw each other's faces. When it was over, Mike called his driver to take her back to the prison. The next day, Mike awoke guiltily to see blood on the bed and wondered why Ken had taken a virgin instead of a sex worker. Since her meeting with Mike, Susan had been sad. Mary noticed her sadness and asked her what was wrong, but Susan said she was fine. Mary assured her that in 2 weeks she would be out and that she would make sure Susan got out too. 2 weeks later, Susan was still in prison and her father was missing. At Ken's mansion, he and Julia were picking out wedding dresses. Mike went to pick up his mother from prison, and although Susan was happy for Mary, she was also sad that she would be left alone. Mary promised her that she would make sure she got out before the end of the week. Mary begged her son to help free Susan. Mike, though unwilling to deal with more drama, agreed out of love for his mother and made several calls. Within a day, Susan was released. Upon returning to her parents' home, Ken and his family were eating like kings. Upon seeing her, they were surprised and asked who had freed her. Susan explained that it was her friend, but her father showed no interest and told her that she was not welcome and should go back where she came from, stating that he did not want to be associated with criminals. Susan felt betrayed and looked up the address Mary had given her. Susan went to the address, but the security guard wouldn't let her in. When Mike came out and saw her, she explained that she just wanted to thank Mary. Mike, sensing that the conversation would make him late, asked the guard to take her to his mother. Upon entering the mansion, Susan was impressed with the interior, thinking it was like heaven on earth. A few minutes later, Mary called her name and Susan came back from her reverie. Susan quickly hurried to greet Madame Mary. To Susan's surprise, Mary had such a beautiful house, but she did not behave like a rich person in prison. Mary smiled and said, "Please come to my room. I don't have the strength to laugh." Susan joined Madame Mary in her room and began to praise her room and the whole mansion, but Mary changed the subject by asking her what she would like to drink and eat. Susan, who was hungry, replied, "Anything." Madame Mary quickly called the kitchen to have something prepared for her guest. She asked Susan about her situation, but Susan, who had been laughing a moment ago, suddenly became sad. Madame Mary asked her what was wrong, and she replied that she needed work in a place where she could sleep, as her parents had kicked her out and called her a criminal, and she had nowhere to go. Mary told her, "You are like a daughter to me, so you can stay here as long as you want." But Susan, who still retained her respect and dignity, said she needed work and not charity or to be pitied. Since Mary knew the kind of person Susan was, she quickly agreed and told her to start working as her nanny and she would pay her very well. Mary decided to change Susan's wardrobe that very day. Everything was happening so fast for Susan, who had only come to the mansion that same day. In the afternoon, when Mike returned and the doorbell rang, Mary quickly asked Susan to go answer the door. Immediately, she opened the door. An unfamiliar breeze blew her hair. Mike was speechless and thought, "What a beauty." He quickly pulled himself together and asked Susan who she was. She replied, "It's me, Susan." Mike was surprised. The Susan he met in the morning was a dirty girl. He asked her what she was still doing in the house, and Mary, who overheard him, quickly replied, "She's my babysitter. I hired her." Mike quickly pulled his mother to another side of the room and asked her if he was doing the right thing, since he only knew Susan from prison. But Mary quickly replied, "She's a good girl. I know exactly what I'm doing." Mike loved his mother so much that he didn't argue with her. The next morning, the doctor came in with bad news about the tests and examinations he and his team performed on Mary. The results were not very good. Mary, who had been through a lot of pain in her life, quickly asked the doctor to tell her the results. Unfortunately, Mary already had one damaged kidney and only one kidney left, which was also damaged and needed a quick transplant. But after a series of tests, Mary's only son was not a match. Mary wasn't worried because she knew Susan would take care of her son when she was gone. So her plan was to tell her son to marry Susan, which was her dying wish. Mike, for his part, tried contacting different hospitals and individuals to get a kidney for his mother, as he had not spent much time with her. His mother was taken away from him when he was just a child, and he couldn't let her go now that they were united again. When Susan heard the news, she felt very sad, but went to Mike to tell the doctor to check his kidney to see if he was a match. Mike was surprised by her disinterest, and, without asking too many questions since he was desperate to save his mother, they quickly went to the hospital. Unfortunately, Susan's kidney was not a match. This really brought Susan to tears, and Mike comforted her. Then they both returned home. When Susan and Mike arrived home, Susan quickly rushed to stay with Mary. Unfortunately, she had already fallen out of her bed. When Susan saw this, she screamed in rage, and Mike quickly went upstairs. They both quickly carried Mary to the bed. Mary asked them to make her a promise. Mike asked what that promise was, and his mother told him to marry Susan, which was her dying wish. Susan was surprised and quickly said no. Mike, for his part, also refused. His mother began her drama again, saying that if they didn't do what she said, she would not allow the doctors to put another kidney in his body. Mike was not convinced, but he was willing to do anything to make sure his mother lived. On the other hand, Mike had promised Ken's family to marry his daughter Julia. He was caught between serving his mother and keeping his promises, but in the end, he chose his mother over everyone else. Reluctantly, he agreed to what his mother said and stated that he would marry Susan. Susan looked at him and began to cry again. The next morning, Mike called Susan to sign a document. When she checked the papers, she saw that it was for a contract marriage. Susan was also pleased because she didn't want to marry anyone, but since Mary's health was more important to her than her own life, she agreed. Mike told her that he had already promised to marry someone and that he could not break that person's heart. Susan, who was not interested in the explanation, quickly replied that she understood. That afternoon, Mike and Susan went to see Mary and both agreed that they were ready to get married. Mary was not convinced and quickly told them to get married the next day. Mike was surprised and asked his mother why the rush. She replied that so he could get the kidney fast and get better sooner. The next morning, Mike called the courthouse for an emergency marriage as he did not want guests at the wedding. News quickly reached Ken's family, and they learned of the new development that Mike was marrying a woman at the courthouse that afternoon. Mary dressed Susan herself, and Mike quickly got dressed up. They both went to the courthouse and, within a few hours, were married. Ken's family arrived very late, and when they arrived, they were surprised to see that Mike had married Susan. Julia started badmouthing Susan, and that's how Mike found out about their relationship. Mike quickly took Ken aside and told him that the marriage was a contract, that he had married her for his mother's sake, and that, once she finished her transplant, he would divorce her. Ken calmed down and took his family home after hearing this new information. The newlywed couple arrived home with her mother, who was in a wheelchair. Susan started to go to her previous room, but Mary quickly stopped her and told her she had to move her things to her husband's room. Mike listened and thought about how he would share his room with her. He had no choice but to play along. In her bedroom, Susan slept in the chair, while Mike slept in the bed. 2 days later, Mary's health took a turn for the worse. She was rushed to the hospital by Susan, who then called Mike, who quickly left his office and went straight to the hospital. The doctor told them they needed a donor fast, otherwise they couldn't save her. They found another person at another hospital who was a match and was also willing to donate for Mary. The supposed donor was miles away, so Mike did everything he could to get him from there. Mary, for her part, was anxious and quickly called Mike and Susan to make another promise, that they would support each other and that they should name their first child, if it was a girl, after her. Mike told his mother to stop saying such things, that the donor was on the way. Unfortunately, before the donor arrived at the hospital, Mary had passed away. The doctor broke the news to Mike and Susan fainted. She was rushed to the hospital, and when she awoke, she cried again at the loss of a woman who had been like a second mother to her. After running some tests, the nurses discovered that Susan was 4 weeks pregnant. The nurse brought the results to Mike, who, upon seeing them, became even more enraged. Susan quickly pulled herself together and, after a week, returned home. A week later, Mary's body was buried by Mike, her friends, and Susan. They all left, but Susan stayed at the grave crying. When she got home, Mike told her that her contract was up and that he would give her some money, but nothing more, suggesting that she go back to the street. Susan screamed that she was pregnant, to which Mike responded by showing the report. Susan, shocked, began to cry again. Mike continued to degrade her and threw her out after making her sign the divorce papers. Susan, devastated, went to Mary's grave and, after spending a few nights there, found an unfinished building where she began to stay. Mike, reflecting on how Susan helped his mother, went out looking for her. When he found her, he rudely asked her to follow him, but she refused. Mike forced her to leave with him and took her back to his mansion, where he continued to mistreat her and told her to cut flowers in the garden in exchange for money, but that she would have to leave once she gave birth. Months later, Julia visited and saw Susan pregnant, quickly informing her father. Ken confronted Mike, who denied being responsible. Relieved, Ken returned home and told his wife, who suggested that Mike and Julia marry before the news broke. A few weeks later, Susan gave birth to twins. Mike, upon seeing the children, was happy and, even though he knew he was not the father, gave them love and gifts. Susan, however, still longed to meet the children's father. Julia went back to visit Mike to discuss their wedding, but noticed that Susan had had twins and became concerned, knowing that they were Mike's children. Mike greeted Julia, but was absorbed to notice that one of the babies had the same birthmark as he did. He thought it was a coincidence and Julia left, feeling uncomfortable. Mike decided to visit Ken's family and, upon arrival, overheard Julia crying and asking what would happen if Mike found out that the children were his biological children. Mike, shocked, returned home and asked Susan for the truth. Susan told him how her father forced her to sleep with an unknown man in a dark room. Mike, shocked, told Susan that no one had come looking for her during her pregnancy and that she should tell him who the father of her children was. After hearing about the wedding, Julia and her father went to the mansion screaming. Ken accused Mike of betraying his daughter. Mike responded that he was only fulfilling his mother's last wish and called the guards to eject Julia and Ken. Susan went downstairs to see what was going on, and Ken revealed to her that Mike was the man who got her pregnant. Susan couldn't believe it and decided to leave. Mike apologized to her, explaining that he had just found out with the DNA results and upon hearing Julia's confession. Susan, feeling betrayed, decided to forgive Mike for the sake of her children. That night, she reflected on why her own father hated her so much and forced her to sleep with a man she didn't even know.